It's gatherings like this that really make us appreciate like minds. I like to think that the world of decorative arts and history is a family. And sometimes when you go to a family reunion, you get to meet family members that you didn't know you had. I already know that Ruth Cook is going to be my cousin because we have many like interests. I had not met Ruth until we talked on the telephone the other day. Of course, today is my first day to greet her in person. I'm looking forward to her speaking at Samford University later this spring, and because she is speaking on a subject that I think Alabamians have heard about, but we know very little about. We think of Sylacauga producing marble, but we didn't know that it produced as much history as it did. And so today, Ruth Cook, who, by the way, I've given everyone else's home state or identity, hails from northern Ohio. And we are happy that she is in the South, and we are happy that she is here with us today. Will we help me join as we welcome Ruth?
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for including me in your program today. I'm delighted to be here. And as he said, I think we all know there's marble over there in Sylacauga, but we may not know a whole lot more about it than that. So I hope when we finish here, you'll have a lot more of information about it. The marble, what I'd like to do first is to bring you up from way a long time ago to the 19th century, which is our theme for today. This is just a sketch that was done by someone at one of the companies there that gives you kind of a sense of where it is. The marble, geology-wise, is between Kahatchee Mountain and Talladega Rebecca Mountain, and basically it's under the Coosa Valley in between. You may not be aware of how extensive that vein of marble is. It runs for 12 miles, for 32 miles. It's 400 feet deep, and it's 1.5 miles wide, which is a huge deposit. When I was working on this book, I had occasion to travel to Vancouver in British Columbia. And Victoria Island there has Butchart Gardens, which are gardens that have been done in a former limestone quarry. They were absolutely beautiful. So I took a lot of pictures, and when I came back, I was talking with some of the executives at Imerys Corporation, which now owns some of the quarries out there. And I said, you know, that this is just wonderful what they've done with this old limestone quarry out there on Victoria Island. And I showed him some of the pictures, and he said, well, that's just beautiful. I said, you know, maybe you could do something like that with your quarries when you're finished with them. And he kind of grinned, and he said, well, it won't be in our lifetimes. He said, we estimate that we will still be quarrying marble in Sylacauga for another 200 to 250 years. So there's a lot of marble in Sylacauga. But looking at this, you can see geology-wise, the marble is part of a slanted landscape, and I want to read you just the beginning part of the prologue of the book because it brings you through how the marble got there, just very briefly. 480 million years ago, shallow seas covered what is now Alabama's Coosa River Valley. Beneath the sunlit surface of these warm waters, a rich Ordovician community of marine organisms, corals and brachiopods, bryozoans and trilobites, absorbed calcium carbonate from the waters and used it to form their protective shells. When these creatures died, they bequeathed their legacy of shells to the floor of the sea. And gradually, over the next 80 million years, the sea level lowered and a beach of sorts, the continental shelf, emerged. Beneath this extensive shelf, rising layers of fossil shells shifted and compacted, creating loose sedimentary rock called chalk. Further sedimentation created limestone, harder than chalk, but not hard enough to take a beautiful polish. But finally, some layers, including specific ones in the middle of the Coosa River Valley, crumpled deeper into the Earth's crust, where heat and pressure drove out impurities and morphed the limestone into a dense, white, crystalline substance. The Greeks gave the world a name for this substance, taking the name from their verb marmarine, which means to shine or sparkle. Smaller quantities of marble occur in Bibb, Calhoun, Clay, Coosa, Etowah, Lee, Macon, St. Clair, and Shelby counties. But the largest deposit is right underneath Sylacauga, Alabama. So I want to share with you a little more about that this afternoon. There are really only 2 other places in the world that have the same crystalline form of marble that we have in Sylacauga. One of those is the Isle of Paros, which is off the coast of Greece. You see this is a photograph from there. Probably the most well-known piece carved from the marble there is what you see on the right, the Winged Victory or Nike, which was done centuries ago. The marble quarries on Paros have pretty much played out at this point, but they were of the same type of marble that we have here. The other place in the world where this type of marble occurs is Carrara in Italy, near the town of Pietrasanta. And you can see a part of one of the quarries there. And I like to say that when Michelangelo had a new commission, that's where he went shopping, most likely, for his marble. Now, there is a difference between the way the marble is quarried in Sylacauga and the way it is in Carrara. You can see from these 2 photographs, in Sylacauga, the marble is underneath the ground and you go down to quarry it and to get it out. In Carrara, it's in the side of a mountain, so you're literally going up to get the marble, but it's still the same geological content. When I was first asked to work on this, I didn't know a whole lot about marble. I've always been interested in art. I learned very early in childhood that I was not going to be an artist, couldn't draw or paint or any of that, but I've always loved what other people do. And so when they first had the Marble Festival, which was part of a sister city thing with Pietrasanta in Italy and the state of Alabama, I didn't know much about the marble, but I agreed to do the research and see what I could find out. So that was on a Monday or a Tuesday, and later in the week, my husband and I sat down to watch an old movie on television in the evening. This was the movie. It had been made in 1949, and if you I don't know if you recognize those 2 people, but that's Patricia Neal on the left, playing the part of Dominique somebody or other, and the person on the right is Gary Cooper, playing the part of Howard Rourke. Do you know what movie I'm talking about? The Fountainhead. So, we're sitting there watching this movie, and I've just, come home and told my husband, I'm going to be doing some research on the marble down in Sylacauga. So we're sitting there watching the movie, and there's a scene in which Patricia Neal, in that beautiful negligee or whatever she's wearing, is in her bedroom. And she looks down. Her father owned a granite quarry, not a marble quarry, but she looks down and she sees this handsome man in the quarry down below and decides that she just has to meet him. So she goes over, there's a marble fireplace in her bedroom. She goes over and she picks up a poker and she smashes one corner of that fireplace. And then she calls her servant and says, you see that man down there in the quarry? Go get him to come up here and fix my fireplace. So in strides Gary Cooper. And I'm watching this movie, and he walks over and he stoops down and he picks up a chunk of her fireplace, and this is what he says. This is Alabama marble. Very high grade, very expensive. And I went, wow. You know, juxtaposition, I guess you'd say. And it turns out from all the research, it is very high grade and very expensive. So we're going to talk a little more about how it got there. And now I'm going to bring you up to the 19th century, okay? Uh-oh. There we go. Okay. The first people to actually notice the marble in Talladega County were Shawnee Native Americans who happened to come from my part of the world. They're originally from Ohio, but they came down and settled in a village on the river there, which they called Sylacauga. And not too long after that, they became part of the Creek Confederation. But they very definitely were aware of the marble in the area because they used it to make arrowheads. And then, as most of us know, the history in the early 1800s, the Creek Confederacy was taken on by Andrew Jackson and his troops who came down from Tennessee to defeat them. And at that point, the Shawnee were part of that group. That happened in 1814. And there was a man who was a military surgeon with Jackson's troops when they came into northern Alabama in 1814. And he also noticed the marble in the area. By 1832, the Creeks had been defeated. They were no longer a viable part of the culture of the state. And settlers from other states, Dr. Bailey was talking earlier about getting across the Chattahoochee. People were coming into Alabama, and they started settling in the Coosa River Valley and established eventually Talladega County. In January of 1834, they opened a land office in Martisville, which is not too far from Talladega in Talladega County. And they began to advertise what had been creek lands for sale to settlers in the Coosa Valley. By 1836, the Treaty of Cusseta had been signed, and all remaining Creek Native Americans had been moved west out of Alabama. So the settlement began at that point. This is a map, or it's a section of a map actually, that's right here in the archives in Montgomery from 1837. So you can see very quickly after that land office opened that people began to not only farm the land in Talladega County, but also to begin quarrying the marble. And you could see on that previous slide the evolution of the name, Sylacauga to Sylacauga to Sylacauga, and finally to what we call it today. Now, that military surgeon that I mentioned was one of the first people to start buying land in Martisville when it came up for sale. He was actually a surgeon at that time in Selma, Alabama, but he was interested in the marble and began to buy up land where he was pretty sure he could quarry it. This is one of the monuments that he actually created. You'll find them in various cemeteries around the state. This one's in the Weguffka Cemetery, and you can barely see, but it says E. Gant, Sylacauga, Alabama over there. The rest of it's been kind of wiped out, but his signature is still clearly there. So he was one of the early people to quarry the marble. It was originally used for monuments, cemetery stones, things like that. There were two other early quarry developers. One of them was a man named George Hurd, who came here from Scotland, and he was so impressed with the marble and with the opportunities here that he sent for his other four brothers to come and join him. And they were quite successful in the early part of the 1800s, quarrying the marble as well. On the left here, you can see this was the kind of the signature that they developed for their stones. You can see it on the stone up above there. And George Hurd and his brothers were in business until shortly before the Civil War in Alabama. The third person who developed quarries at that time was a man that everybody called Alphabet Nix, rather. His name, if I can remember, it was Napoleon Madison Bonaparte something else Nix. So they just called him Alphabet. But he was not only a quarry person, he was also a person who did the lettering and the etching on the stones. And he had a business right here in Montgomery where he lettered the stone. So you had these three people early on in the 1800s. I had been told that there were monuments in the Pine Hill Cemetery in Auburn by both the Hurd brothers and Edward Gant. It took me 2 tries and walking the entire cemetery before I spotted them, because the signatures are so hard to see so many years later. But I did eventually find them. They're side by side in the cemetery that's right there back behind the campus in Auburn. The one on the left was done by Edward Gant. The one on the right was done by George Hurd. Now these would have been done in the 1830s, 1840s, in that era. Now also in 1849 was when they began to build the Washington Monument. And as often happens when you start researching a topic like this, people will tell you, oh, did you know, whatever. And one of the things I heard was, did you know that the Washington Monument is all Alabama marble? Well, no, not exactly. The monument itself has no Alabama marble in it. However, when they began building it, they sent out requests to states, to cities, to chambers of commerce, Masonic groups, to people all over the country and even in other countries, inviting them to send stones that represented their state, that could be set into the walls inside. And if you've ever been inside the Washington Monument, those stones are all exactly the same size, are embedded in the walls all the way up around that staircase. Well, Alabama has 2 of them in there. The one on the bottom that you see here is presented by a Masonic lodge. It was lettered by Alphabet Nix in Montgomery, here in Montgomery. And the one at the top is the one that the state of Alabama chose to send to be represented in the Washington Monument. Both of these were quarried at Gant's Quarry, which is the quarry that Edward Gant had opened when he first came to Talladega County. I do think when you consider that this was between 1849 and 1852, I think what Alabama chose to put on its stone is an interesting comment. It says, Alabama, a union of equality as adjusted by the Constitution. So you can see the states' rights kind of image there even at that point. So that was 1849. And of course, as all industries had, when the Civil War came along, it devastated the industry in the South, and the quarries were not spared from that. They all pretty much went dormant for quite some time. The first mention you see of them after that period, I don't know if any of you has seen the beautiful biography of Eugene A. Smith that Eileen Kilgore Henderson wrote a few years ago. If you are the least bit interested in geology, it's a wonderful story about his life and his travels around Alabama, reporting on the various stone. This book was very helpful to me because she documented many of his visits to the quarries in Talladega. And one of the things he said, when he traveled there in 1875, he had a Studebaker wagon that was pulled by a mule at this point, and he would travel around the state to report on the rock. But he said of Gant's Quarry particularly, and the whole Talladega area, he said, we may reasonably expect someday to see this belt of marble become valuable property. At present, there's little demand for it, though some years ago, quite an extensive business was carried on by Dr. Gant, Mr. Nix, Messrs. Hurd, and others. So he saw the potential for the marble in 1875, but nothing was being done with it at that point. Not long after that, in 1878, Redfield Proctor, who at that time was a U.S. Senator up in Vermont, who later became the governor of the state, just happened to own a few marble quarries up in Vermont. And he kept hearing about this pure white crystalline stuff down here in Alabama. So he sent a spy down to check it out. And the spy came back and he reported that Alabama marble, well, he reported back and Redfield Proctor issued a press release or whatever they called it at that point, saying Alabama marble is undesirable and the physical conditions at the quarry site are adverse to successful operation. That was partially true, but it was also good for his business. It was true that it was much more difficult to quarry this marble than many other places, partly because you have to go down to get it, and partly because its makeup is harder to get out of the ground. So that was 1878. Still, the quarries stayed dormant through much of the rest of the 1800s. You don't hear much about the marble again until the early 1900s, when business began to pick up and the economy was better. This is an interesting piece. This was done in Alabama marble in 1908 by a man named Gutzon Borglum. Anybody know who that is? This is the man who later carved the presidents into Mount Rushmore. But in 1908, and I have yet to figure out how he came across the piece of Alabama marble. There's no record of that, but it is documented that that's what it is. And he created this bust of Lincoln. If you go to the Capitol complex today, it's still on display in the rotunda, or at least it was 6 months ago. So that was 1908. Now, just to bring you kind of forward a little bit, when you get to about 1904, 1905, the story of what happens with Sylacauga marble kind of goes, it's like a fork in the road. There were two main companies that began in the early 1900s, and they brought the marble appreciation forward. The first of those was a company called Moretti Hera, and you may be familiar with the name Moretti. Giuseppe Moretti was the man who fashioned Vulcan, that largest cast iron statue that's up on the top of Red Mountain in Birmingham. But what many people don't know is that Moretti was much more of a marble sculptor than he was working in cast iron. He did that piece to represent Alabama at the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, which was held in St. Louis in 1904. But that same year, he met a man in Birmingham named Charles Adams, who took him out for a ride to the Sylacauga area and showed him the dormant quarries. And he was extremely impressed with the quality of the marble. He brought a piece back with him, this is in 1903 or 4, to Birmingham, and carved the piece that you see on the right. This is the head of Christ. His concept was that this was after the crucifixion, when he was at peace, and that's what he created. He took it with him to St. Louis. Vulcan was shipped and reassembled there, and you can see how huge that mining and metals building had to be in St. Louis, because that's Vulcan inside the building. Vulcan won the grand prize for mining and metallurgy at the St. Louis Fair in 1904, but most people don't know that the head of Christ over there on the right won the silver medal in creative arts. If you'd like to see it, it's up on the 3rd floor in this building. And there's a story about behind how it got there. It was actually donated by Moretti's wife after his death, but there was some back and forth. The Vulcan people wanted it, and the archives wanted it, but Dorothea, his wife, wanted it here, and here it is. So you have that piece, which is absolutely beautiful if you want to go up to the 3rd floor and see it. Now, Moretti, there's a whole other story I could tell you about him and his work, but I'm just going to touch briefly on that. He was an incredibly talented sculptor, but he wasn't the world's greatest businessman. And unfortunately, he invested several times in quarries, but lost his interest in them for various reasons at different times. But when he created Montepino, which was an Italian artisan village near one of the early quarries that he tried to develop, he also took on an apprentice, a woman named Geneva Mercer, who was from Marengo County here in Alabama. He was very impressed with her work. She was studying at Livingston, and Miss Julia Tutwiler brought her work to a Chamber of Commerce meeting in Birmingham, and he was so impressed. She was looking for scholarship money to get Geneva money to go to Chicago to study, and Mr. Moretti said, "She doesn't need to do that. I want her to study with me." She came to Montepino and lived with him and his wife, studied under him, created her own work, and as well as helping him with all of his, and remained a part of their family for the rest of her life. The piece that you see on the right there is a copy that she made of his marble head of Christ. It's plaster of Paris. It's still in the St. Jude's Catholic Church sanctuary in Sylacauga. Now, again, I'm not going to go down the rabbit trail of her whole life, but I do want to let you know that right here in Montgomery, at the Montgomery Museum of Fine Arts, is at least one piece of her work, which is the Flint Fountain that you see over on the right. And some of you, I believe they have a summer festival called the Flint Festival that's based on that. Anybody know what a flimp is? It's an elf or like a fairy creature or whatever. And that whole fountain, yes.
We have 3 pieces in the collection.
You do? Okay. That's the only one I have a photograph of. But I'm speaking there tomorrow, so I will check out what the other 2 are. But all of those are little creatures on that fountain that she created. She was very talented, but she also admired his work greatly. Now, as far as other pieces that were created, the one over here on the left, 1904, this is a bust of W.E.B. Davis, who was an early medical person in Birmingham at Hillman Hospital. And this is a bust that Moretti created when he was in Birmingham working on Vulcan. It's still in the medical college library at UAB. The piece in the middle was created while he had his Italian artisan village up at Montepino. You can see the preparation pieces, I want to say, for the piece on the right. That is Mary Cahalan, who was an early teacher at the Powell School in Birmingham, and that piece still sits outside the original library building in Birmingham in Lynn Park. The third one on the right, created in 1908, and these were all done in Alabama marble, is Father Patrick O'Reilly, who helped found St. Vincent's Hospital in Birmingham. It was out on the grounds somewhere for a long time, but today, if you drive up to the main doorway or the main doors of St. Vincent's Hospital, there's a kind of a circular drive, and off to the left, Father Patrick is there greeting you. And again, Alabama marble. It was used extensively by Moretti Hera, the company that Mr. Moretti helped found, and also by the Alabama Marble Company in what we call dimension stone. This is not sculpture, but this is marble that's used in building buildings. And so in the early 1900s, it was extremely popular across the country for use. You can see here the Brown Marks building in Birmingham, which was built in 1906. The first 2 floors of that have an extensive amount of marble, and they're in the process of refurbishing all of that now. I don't have a slide of it, but the recent renovation of the Lyric Theater has uncovered flooring that is all Sylacauga marble. And they found a room down in the basement that is filled with slabs of it. They aren't quite sure whether those were intended for something or taken down from something, but they're all Sylacauga marble. And I recently went out to the Bright Star out in Bessemer, which was built in 1915, and you know that they have the murals that were done by traveling artists. But what they recently discovered when they were spiffing up for the bicentennial, and they took some paneling off of the walls. If you're familiar with that restaurant, there are nice, cozy little booths all along the main part of it. They took down the wood paneling on the side, and behind it was all panels of marble that the Alabama Marble Company had installed there. So it's all around if you keep looking. This is kind of a heartbreak one. This is what was the terminal station in Birmingham, built in 1909. Extensive use of Alabama Marble Company marble throughout that. Unfortunately, it was torn down a couple years before people decided to start saving the kinds of things that I know all of you treasure in our artistic world. I moved here in 1970 and unfortunately never saw this in reality. Also, the U.S. Post Office building in Mobile was torn down about the same time, but all of those arches and much of the inner trimming was Alabama marble. Over there on the right is the city select council chambers in City Hall in Philadelphia, and that marble is still there. That has not been torn down. I was also told when I started working on this that the Lincoln Memorial, that was Alabama marble. Well, not exactly. The statue is not. But if you look at that ceiling up above, they chose the marble from Gant's quarry for that ceiling because it could be sliced to 1/8 of an inch thick and still have its strength. And by slicing it that thin, it becomes translucent. And what they wanted was a ceiling that would allow light to come down on the statue. The reason it has that kind of amber color is because when they put it in, they rubbed it with beeswax to get it even, more translucent. So each of those panels up there is filled with Alabama marble. That was 1922. 1935, they built the U.S. Supreme Court building in Washington, and much of the marble trim on the inside of the first and second floors, like the wainscoting, the sashes around the doors and the windows, all came from the Alabama Marble Company in Sylacauga. Also, there is a staircase in there that was done with marble from Moretti Hara. They fashioned the steps, they put it together to make sure it worked, then dismantled it, shipped it up, and put it back together again. Also in that building, the Great Hall that's outside the chambers where the Supreme Court justices hear their cases, there are 16, I believe, of those pillars. They are all from the Moretti Hera quarries in Sylacauga. And the reason we know that is because, let's see, how do I go back here? The Hurd brothers had some people working with them named Miller. And when George Hurd brought all his other brothers over here, the Millers said, I don't think we're going to be much part of this company. And they went to Mississippi, to Columbus, and formed the Columbus Marble Works. Yeah. And they were the ones who, that family owned quarries in Talladega for quite some time. But here what you see is the unfinished pillars for what you see over there on the right in the U.S. Supreme Court building. They were quarried. One of the differences between Alabama Marble Company and Moretti Hera was Alabama Marble Company had its own finishing shops. When they got orders, they quarried the marble, they cut the marble, and then they finished and polished it. Moretti Hera, on the other hand, would quarry the marble for their orders, and then they shipped it other places to be finished. And so those pillars that are on those railroad cars went to a place up in Tennessee to be finished and then shipped to Washington. One more early on story that I think is interesting. 1933, The Alabama Marble Company was sending a shipment of finished marble, or pieces of finished marble, up to somewhere up north, and there was a train wreck up around Vinemont, and 2 of the cars jumped the track and overturned, and the marble pieces kind of, they smashed into smaller pieces. They weren't usable for the order anyway. So they called over to St. Bernard Abbey, and they said, we have all this marble lying over here by the railroad track, and if any of your monks would like to have it for any reason, you can come and get it. Well, most of you are probably familiar with Brother Joseph, who created the Ave Maria Grotto with all the little miniatures buildings. He was just delighted to get all of that marble. And I had heard that it had been used in the grotto, but I had no idea the extent until I went and visited it. This is, I have to get this right now, Saint Teresa of Lisieux. This is her grotto at the Ave Maria place up in Coleman. All of the surrounding pieces that you see there are marble that was carted back by the monks that had been part of that shipment from the Alabama Marble Company. So, and there is a wonderful documentary about this that was made by a filmmaker from Tennessee about Brother Joseph and his monuments. Another place that you would see Alabama marble, I mentioned a minute ago that Geneva Mercer's Head of Christ is there. This is the altar in St. Jude's. And the marble for that was donated by the 4 families that own the Alabama Marble Company. This was built in 1949. That altar is one complete piece, and then the stairs, were done to complement it. And that is also still there. Now, the rest of this story, I'm just going to bring you up. I know we're talking about the early 1800s, but they did ask me to bring this up to the present, so I'm going to take you a little further. From the early 1900s through the 1930s, 1940s, Alabama marble was used, as I said, as dimension stone for building. And then, beginning in the late 1930s, people began to realize that marble, beautiful as it is, was much more subject to damage from pollution than granite was. In other words, using it as a facade on the outside of buildings wasn't going to work, especially if it was thinner. A thick piece was fine, but the thinner, like facades, couldn't be done. And so the owners of Moretti Hera and Alabama Marble kind of began to see what was happening, that they were no longer going to have the business they had had in dimension stone. So they began to look for other ways to use the stone. Unfortunately, the most successful of those was, gives me a shudder to say it, grinding it up into fine powder. And so beginning in the 1930s, shortly before World War II, and on up through the 1960s, the majority of the marble that was quarried in Sylacauga was brought out, ground up into various thicknesses of fine powder, and it's called GCC, or ground calcium carbonate. And that's what they did with it, because that was the business that was available. Very little sculpting was done with it, and virtually no dimension stone anymore. So it was a totally different industry. I pulled this, you can see piles of it here, and you can see over on the right many of the different uses of it. The most interesting ones to me, watch my time here, the most interesting ones to me were, if you open up a piece of chewing gum in a foil wrapper, the little powder that's on there to keep it from sticking, that's Alabama marble most likely. It's in your bread, if it says calcium fortified. Basically, marble is calcium carbonate. So they put that powder in your bread to fortify with calcium. They use it in paint thinners. Those coatings that make it difficult for you to sign on a receipt these days on paper? That coating has a lot of calcium carbonate in it. It's everywhere. And you can see over there all kinds of different uses for it. One of the funnier stories that I heard when I was doing the research, Lila Ezekiel and her husband used to have a store out in Gant's Quarry. The Gant's Quarry was a company village for the Alabama Marble Company. The people who grew up there were wonderful in sharing their stories of their childhood and their fathers working in the mill, in the quarries and so on. But Lila and her husband owned this store, and she had marble countertops where, the cash register and things were. And a salesman came in one day, he was making his rounds as he always did, and he brought her a case of Tums. Of course, Tums and its sisters, that's all GCC. It's ground calorie, when you have to take a Pepsid or whatever, that's what that is ground up marble. But anyway, she said, he looked at her marble countertop and he said, he said, how did they get all that powder back together to make that so pretty? And she said, I just looked at him and shook my head. I didn't think it was worth trying to explain. So from the 30s on up through the 60s, that's what you had. It was not being used for artistic purposes. But in 1969, it was made the state rock. Did you know that marble is the state rock of Alabama? It is. But then what happened 10 years ago, and I'll make this short, but 10 years ago, the Alabama State Council on the Arts decided to create kind of like a sister city relationship between the whole state of Alabama and the city of Pietrasanta in Italy. And the first year, they sent Alabama arts to Italy to share with the people in Pietrasanta. But it wasn't all marble. They sent an Italian translation of Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. They sent G's Ben Quilters. They sent Nall and some of his artwork and various other representations. But they also sent the mayor of Sylacauga and his wife, and some people that represented the marble industry in Sylacauga. So they went over to Italy. The following year, which was 10 years ago, they brought artists from Pietrasanta to the whole state of Alabama to celebrate Italian art. And Mayor Wright and Ted Spears, who eventually founded the Magic of Marble Festival, decided that if those Italian people were coming to Alabama, they had to come to Talladega, and they had to share the marble experience. So they brought them there. It was so successful that first year that we just last year celebrated the 10th Magic of Marble Festival in Sylacauga. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. But what they started doing was bringing a master sculptor from Italy each year, and then inviting sculptors from all over Alabama, excuse me, and from all over the United States to come and study there. And they would open up Bluebell Park, that's right across from the really good ice cream place across the street. Bluebell would run power cables through the storm sewers and up to the, excuse me a second, up to the park so the sculptors could work, and they had a festival. They still have quarry tours. There's an extensive collection of works that have been done by Italian artists and American artists in the Comer Library there as well. And I want to show you just a few pieces to wind this up. Excuse me. In 2009, Rino Giannini was the master sculptor from Italy, and this is the piece that he created. If you walk into the Comer Library and look to your right, this is what you will see. It's a beautiful piece called We're All in the Same Boat, which I like. The next year, they brought Giovanni Balderi as the master sculptor from Italy, and he created the piece you see there called The Mask. And his concept was that we all have masks. Some of them are to hide things about ourselves, and some of them are to project things about ourselves. Beautiful piece of work. Here's just some pictures from around various of the festival. You can see people working on their work. I have a neighbor who went to the festival last year on the first or second day, and she literally went back 2 more times during the week because she wanted to see what a particular sculptor had done with his work. All of the marble is donated by the commercial companies that are out there grinding the stuff up now, but they do contribute marble for the festival. The piece you see on the right it has a pedestal and it turns. That's Penelope on the right. On this side, if you turn it around, it's Ulysses on the back. So it's the husband and wife Odyssey thing. Sylacauga now has its own resident sculptor. His name is Craigor Brown, and he is incredibly talented. And I want to show you a progression of a piece that he did on commission. It's on the grounds of the City Hall in Sylacauga. This is where it started, a big block of Alabama marble. Here he is working on it a little bit more. And his concept was, this is a man carving himself out of, he called it Sylacauga emerging, and it's him carving himself out of the marble. And there it is today on the grounds of the City Hall. He has also recently created this piece. If you go to Ivy Green up in Tuscumbia, the home of Helen Keller, this is a piece that he did, a distance shot on the left and a little bit of a close-up on the right. This is also done from Sylacauga marble, and it's the moment, of course, when Helen Keller discovers that there's a word for the water that she feels on her hand. Right now, he has a commission to finish a piece for the grounds of the City Hall in Vestavia Hills, which is where he grew up. In fact, he went to high school with both of my sons. But he's an incredible sculptor. He studied at Montevallo and then in Pietrasanta for several years before he came back. I was going to tell you one more thing. What was it? Oh, one of his more recent pieces was done in a partnership with one of the master sculptors who had come to the festival. It is in the sculpture garden at the Montgomery Museum of Fine Arts. You may have seen write-ups about it. It's called Nuestra Luna, and it's a dual-sided piece again. A modern scene on the right, on one side, and a classic scene done by the Italian sculptor on the other side. So I hope this gives you an idea of, it's kind of an odyssey of from artistic into industrial, and now what you have is a partnership between the industrial companies who very much support the artistic efforts in Sylacauga. So now you have it used in industry, but you also have a renaissance of the artistic uses of it. So I hope you found that interesting, and I'll be glad to answer questions if you have any. Questions? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. That was a wonderful presentation. I know that we now have a greater appreciation not only for Sylacauga, but for all of Alabama's great resources. You know, when we were talking about this gathering, Carol and Joey and I realized that we were going to be fewer in number this year. And in some ways, the intimacy of this group makes me feel like I have been eavesdropping on a salon gathering on Government Street. I think we can go away with some thoughts today. And if this were a salon gathering on Government Street, we would have heard the Border Brothers, Horace King, DeFore maybe talking about wallpaper, Giuseppe Morelli talking about marble. But when you go home today from this salon gathering, I hope that you can carry your thoughts and what you've gleaned in a basket. I have heard Native American descendants from the Creek tribe say that the sign of a great basket is that it is so tightly woven that it can carry water. I think these speakers that joined me today wove a great basket. They have assembled thoughts, and it's all for you to carry home with you these thoughts so that they will enrich you and inspire you to share gatherings like this with others so that next year and the next we can build a greater foundation. Carol, I appreciate you letting me be a part of this group, and I look forward to great things down the road.